Matthew Scott Sullivan. On the surface, the Sullivans looked like an ordinary military family. Matthew Scott Sullivan was a Navy sailor stationed in San Diego, married to Elizabeth, the mother of their 2 daughters. They lived in the quiet Point Loma neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors wave and no one expects the worst. But behind the front door, the marriage was quietly falling apart. Money was tight. The couple had drifted into separate bedrooms, and Elizabeth had begun seeing someone else. On the 13th of October, 2014, Elizabeth met with a divorce lawyer. That same evening, inside their home, Matthew took her life while their children were elsewhere in the house. She was 32. What he did next is what set this case apart. Rather than report her death, he made her disappear. How do you hide a person for nearly 2 years without anyone noticing? Sullivan's answer, according to prosecutors, was cold and patient. The theory presented at trial was that he stored her body in a garage freezer to slow decomposition, keeping the truth locked away, while ordinary life carried on around him. The morning after she died, he bought carpet cleaner. Then he settled into a new role, the worried husband whose wife had simply vanished. He reported Elizabeth missing. He sat for interviews. He spoke to reporters as a heartbroken man desperate for answers, all while the answers sat hidden under his own roof. For a time it worked. There was no body, no obvious scene, and no clear reason to doubt the grieving picture he painted in front of the cameras. So what finally gave him away? The cracks began with small things that did not fit. Elizabeth had transferred roughly $1,000 into her personal account, then never touched it. She never called a friend, never messaged a relative, never reached out to anyone after that October night. People do not vanish into silence so completely, especially a mother of 2 with a life still in motion, and investigators noticed every gap in his account. Then came the physical proof. Inside the bedroom, investigators found Elizabeth's blood. Hidden in the attic, they recovered the knife. And in 2016, a cadaver dog brought into the garage alerted to the unmistakable trace of a body that had once been kept there. The timing of what happened next was almost too neat. On the 4th of October, 2016, the same day movers arrived to pack up his cross-country relocation to the East Coast, Elizabeth's remains surfaced floating in San Diego Bay, roughly half a mile from the home they had once shared. After 2 years of stillness, her body had moved at the precise moment he was leaving town. Was it a coincidence, or had he simply run out of places to hide the past? By then, Sullivan had built a new life nearly 3,000 miles away. He was arrested on the 31st of January 2018 at his home in Wyoming, Delaware, and brought back to California to answer for what he had done. The man who had played the grieving husband for the cameras now faced a jury at last. That jury did not fully accept the prosecution's portrait of premeditation. On the 13th of March, 2021, they convicted him of second-degree murder rather than first, concluding he was responsible for Elizabeth's death, but stopping short of finding it planned. San Diego Superior Court Judge Albert Harutunian III sentenced him to 16 years to life, 15 to life for the killing, and 1 additional year for use of the weapon. Sullivan did not accept the outcome quietly. He appealed, but the California Court of Appeal upheld his conviction, adjusting only a minor administrative fee. The verdict stood, and so did the long silence he had so patiently built around it. Sullivan's deception relied on silence and concealment. The next man on our list would reach for something far more precise, hiding harm not inside a home, but inside something a family trusted without a second thought. George Trepel. George Trepel was not an obvious danger. He was a Mensa member, a self-taught chemist, and a man who took pleasure in puzzles and riddles. He and his wife, Dr. Deanna Carr, lived in rural Alturas, Florida, beside the Carr family, with whom they shared a long and bitter history of disputes over noise, property, and the way each household chose to live. What the Carrs did not know was that the quiet man next door had once worked as the chemist for an illegal laboratory and had served roughly 2.5 years in federal prison for it. In the autumn of 1988, Peggy Jean Carr began to feel inexplicably ill. Her hair fell out, her limbs ached, her body seemed to be shutting down piece by piece, and doctors could not explain why. She slipped into a coma, and on the 3rd of March, 1989, she was removed from life support and died. 6 other members of the household had fallen sick around the same time, several of them hospitalized for months as their strength drained away. Earlier, the family had even received an anonymous note warning them to leave the area, a message no one could quite explain at the time. What could poison an entire family inside their own home? The answer came from a sharp-eyed neurologist who recognized the pattern of hair loss and nerve pain and suspected thallium, a rare and toxic heavy metal once used in pest control. Lab tests confirmed the grim diagnosis, and the question shifted from what was harming the Carrs to who had placed it within their reach. Investigators turned to the kitchen and found their delivery method: an 8-pack of glass Coca-Cola bottles. Thallium was present in 3 full bottles and 4 empty ones, and the caps showed signs of being pried off and resealed with a tool. Someone had laced the family's soft drinks and returned them to the shelf as if nothing had changed. Suspicion soon turned next door. When detectives first spoke with Treple that December, he offered a strange, revealing remark, suggesting someone simply wanted the Carrs to move out of their home. It was an odd thing to volunteer about a family still fighting for their lives, and it lodged in the minds of the detectives who heard it. How do you prove that a brilliant chemist is also a killer? The investigation took an inventive turn. Detective Susan Gorek went undercover, working her way into the Treples' social circle. The couple even hosted a themed murder mystery weekend built around the idea of poisoning, with Treple happily playing host. After the Treples relocated to Sebring, Gorek arranged to rent their old Altura's home, a move that quietly handed investigators lawful access to the property the chemist had left behind. On the 12th of December, 1989, a search of the garage uncovered a bottle of powder containing thallium. The case went to trial in early 1991 and stretched across a month, with more than 70 witnesses called by the state. The jury recommended death by a vote of 9-3, and the trial judge imposed that sentence on the 6th of March, 1991. Treple was convicted of first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, 7 counts of poisoning, and 1 count of product tampering. The conviction was not without later controversy. The testimony of an FBI chemist who worked on the case was criticized in a 1997 Justice Department review of the Bureau's laboratory practices, a detail his defenders would seize on for years to come. So where is the puzzle-loving chemist now? George Treple is still alive and still on Florida's death row at Union Correctional Institution, where he has spent more than 3 decades. His direct appeal was affirmed by the Florida Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to take up his case, and his last major federal appeal was denied in 2012. No execution date has ever been set, and to this day, he maintains that he is innocent. His former wife divorced him years ago, and the family he once lived beside has never received the answer of why their neighbor turned their kitchen into a trap. Treple concealed his weapon inside something the Carr family drank without a thought. The next case moves from a chemist's quiet patience to a confrontation far more physical, and to a defendant whose own past kept circling back to the very same accusation. Stacy Castor. The press called Stacy Castor the Black Widow, and few labels have ever fit so neatly. A woman from Weedsport, New York, she had 2 daughters from her first marriage to Michael Wallace before she married David Castor, who owned the heating and cooling company where she herself worked alongside him. To outsiders, she was simply a wife who had endured far more than her share of loss, a woman the neighbors pitied rather than feared. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was something else entirely. In August 2005, David Castor died after ingesting antifreeze, and the scene was arranged to suggest he had taken his own life. Investigators would later conclude that Stacy sedated him and used an ordinary kitchen turkey baster to force the poison down his throat as he lay helpless. But how do you stage a suicide and expect no one to look closer? For a while, it held. Yet Stacy's history invited scrutiny. Her first husband, Michael Wallace, had died in 2000, his passing originally written off as a heart attack. After suspicion grew around David's death, investigators took the rare step of exhuming Michael's body, and his death was reclassified as a poisoning by the very same chemical that had killed David years later. 2 husbands, 2 identical ends, one common thread running between them. And at the center of both stood the same wife who had quietly profited from each loss. Then, in 2007, as investigators closed in, Stacy did something that turned suspicion into certainty. She targeted her own daughter, Ashley, attempting to end her life over many hours, and left behind a forged note written to read as a confession to both husbands' deaths. The aim was to make Ashley appear responsible and seal off the only path that still led back to Stacy herself. What kind of person would frame their own child simply to escape the closing net? The plan unraveled on its details. Ashley survived, and the forged note carried a fatal flaw. It misspelled the word antifreeze as anti-free, the exact way Stacy had pronounced it during an earlier interview. Worse for her, computer timestamps revealed the note had been written while Ashley was away at school, making it impossible for the young woman to have authored a single line of it. The forensic picture was just as damning. On David's drinking glass, the only fingerprints belonged to Stacy. The turkey baster, recovered from the kitchen trash, carried both the poison and David's own genetic material, evidence consistent with force feeding. And in the autopsies of both husbands, examiners found the same telltale crystals that poisoning of this kind leaves behind in the body. A quiet chemical signature that tied the 2 separate deaths together beyond any coincidence. Money sat at the heart of it. Stacy had stood to gain from the deaths around her, and she had also tampered with paperwork to steer what was left toward herself. On the 5th of February, 2009, a jury convicted Stacy of murdering David, attempting to take Ashley's life, and falsifying a will. At sentencing the following month, Onondaga County Judge Joseph Fahey handed down 51 years to life, telling her that across decades in the justice system, among every kind of killer he had ever come to encounter, she stood in a class all by herself. So how did the story of the Black Widow finally end? Stacy Castor never walked free again, and she never admitted guilt. On the 11th of June, 2016, she died in prison at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women, her death attributed to a heart attack while she was still pursuing an appeal of her conviction. She was 48. The woman who had worked so carefully to rewrite the deaths of those closest to her left behind a record that no misspelled note could ever undo. Castor reached for a common household liquid and a forged confession to bury her tracks. The next case carries us north to a woman whose name became shorthand for a particular kind of betrayal, and whose careful plan came undone over a single misspelled word. Suraj S. Kumar. In the southern Indian state of Kerala, Suraj S. Kumar appeared to have an ordinary life. He was a private bank employee from Kollam, and in March 2018 he married Uthra, a young woman who lived with a disability. Her family had given a substantial dowry, including a large quantity of gold, a car, and a sum of cash, and the couple soon had a young son together. Beneath that calm surface, prosecutors said, Suraj saw his wife not as a partner, but as a path to money he could keep only if she were gone. A divorce would have forced him to return the dowry. So he reportedly chose a method designed to look like nothing more than tragic misfortune. How do you disguise a killing as an act of nature? Beginning in late 2019, Suraj quietly studied venomous snakes online, learning how they behaved, how they struck, and how their bites would be read by anyone examining the body afterward. In early March 2020, he made a first attempt, arranging for Uthra to be bitten by a Russell's viper. She survived. Then, on a night in early May, at her parents' home in Anshal, he gave her sleep-inducing pills and used a cobra to bite her as she slept. This time she did not survive, and the family was left to grieve what looked like a freak tragedy. The detail that shook an entire nation came from Suraj himself. He later confessed that he had starved the cobra for 11 days to make it more aggressive, keeping the animal confined without food before the killing. A post-mortem of the snake reportedly showed an empty stomach. He had bought the creatures from a local snake catcher who would later become a key witness against him. At first, no one suspected him. The death was attributed to Sarpa dosha, a belief tied to the wrath of serpents, and sorrow settled over the household. But Uthra's relatives could not ignore one fact. This was the second snake bite she had endured in 3 months. Could fortune truly strike the same young woman twice in so short a span? A respected snake expert, Vava Suresh, urged the family to contact police, pointing out that a cobra could not have naturally found its way into an air-conditioned room. That single observation cracked the case open. A crime branch special investigation team, led by a senior officer, began assembling a scientific case piece by piece, treating the snake itself as evidence. Investigators conducted a post-mortem on the cobra and a reconstruction known as a dummy test, which showed that the depth of Uthra's wounds did not match a natural bite. They examined his phone search history, traced where the snakes had come from, and the snake catcher who had supplied the creatures agreed to testify against him. Faced with the weight of the evidence, Suraj confessed publicly in July 2020. The trial that followed went on to make legal history. What does the law do with a killer who turned a living creature into his weapon? On the 11th of October, 2021, the Kollam Additional Sessions Court convicted Suraj of murder, attempted murder, causing harm by poison, and destruction of evidence. 2 days later, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment, adding a second life term for the earlier attempt, 10 years for poisoning, and 7 years for destroying evidence, along with a 5 lakh rupee fine. It was regarded as the first case in Kerala in which a live animal had been used as a murder weapon. Suraj is held today at Pujapura Central Jail. He has challenged his conviction before the Kerala High Court, while Uthra's family has filed their own appeal seeking the death penalty. As of the middle of 2026, no ruling has been made public, and the appeal appears to remain unresolved. A request for parole was rejected, and a film inspired by the case was announced in late 2025. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Suraj relied on a living creature to mask his intentions, trusting that superstition would carry the blame. The next case trades the exotic for the everyday, turning an item found in millions of homes into a quiet instrument of harm. Lana Sue Clayton. In the quiet lakeside community of Lake Wylie, South Carolina, Lana Sue Clayton lived what looked like a comfortable life. She worked as a nurse for the Department of Veterans Affairs and shared a roughly $1 million home with her husband, Stephen, a retired businessman. He had been married several times before, and to those who knew them, theirs seemed a settled later-in-life marriage. What no one realized was how much quiet resentment had gathered behind the walls of that house. Over 3 days in July 2018, Lana poisoned Stephen by slipping eye drops into his drinking water. The active ingredient, tetrahydrozoline, is tasteless and odorless, yet strong enough to be deadly in the wrong amount. On the 3rd day, Stephen was found lifeless at the foot of the stairs in their home. How could a few drops from a small bottle bring down a grown man? That is exactly what nearly let her walk away. The chemical leaves no obvious sign to the naked eye, and Stephen's death was first treated as natural, perhaps a heart attack. A funeral was very nearly held, but Stephen's family refused to accept the easy answer. His sister and other relatives pushed hard for an autopsy, and that autopsy revealed poisonous levels of tetrahydrozoline in his body. Suspicion turned at once toward the nurse who shared his home. As a medical professional, Lana knew precisely what the chemical was and what it could do. Investigators learned she had also burned his will and thrown his phone into a lake, cutting off any chance he had to call for help in his final hours. But this was not the first time Stephen had come close to death under that roof. 2 years earlier, in 2016, Lana had wounded Stephen in the back of the head with a crossbow while he slept. At the time, astonishingly, it had been written off as an accident, and he survived. Looking back, investigators saw it for what it most likely was: a first attempt that had simply failed to finish the job. When the truth finally surfaced, Lana did not deny spiking his water. She claimed she had only wanted to make him feel unwell and uncomfortable, insisting she never meant to take his life. Yet she also admitted that she wanted him to suffer, an admission that would follow her into the courtroom. So how does a court weigh a poisoner who says she only wanted her husband to hurt? On the 16th of January, 2020, Lana pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and to tampering with food or drugs. York County Circuit Judge Paul Birch sentenced her to 25 years in prison, with a concurrent term for the tampering charge. The judge made no effort to hide his contempt, challenging her claim that she had merely wanted to teach her husband a lesson when she had let him suffer across 3 long days and had simply ignored him as he faded. Today, Lana Clayton is serving that 25-year sentence in a South Carolina prison. She declined interviews, saying only that she was now at peace. Stephen's family was left with the knowledge that an ordinary bottle from any pharmacy shelf had been used to end his life, drop by patient drop. The shape of the marriage itself raised questions. Stephen was an older, retired businessman, reportedly on his 6th or 7th marriage, with no children of his own to ask questions once he was gone. Lana, younger and trained in medicine, stood to gain from his death, and prosecutors said plain money drove it. The chemical she chose suited a quiet plan, a compound that narrows the blood vessels and can stop a heart while leaving little behind for a casual examiner to catch. Why stretch it across 3 slowed days instead of 1 final dose? That question cut to the center of the sentencing. Stephen did not slip away quickly. He grew sicker over several days while the person closest to him watched and did nothing, even as the chemical gathered in his body. To the judge, that long silence turned a claim of merely wanting to teach a lesson into something far harder to accept. Clayton turned a harmless-looking household product into a silent weapon inside her own home. The next case widens that very idea to a frightening scale, carrying the danger out of one private kitchen and onto the shelves of ordinary stores, where complete strangers became part of the plan. Stella Nichol. Stella Nichol grew up poor and learned early how to bend the truth, building a record of fraud and forgery long before her name became infamous. By the 1980s, she had married Bruce Nichol and settled near Auburn, Washington. To the outside world, they were an unremarkable couple, but Stella had taken out life insurance on Bruce, including a substantial payout that would only apply if his death were ruled an accident, and that single clause would shape everything that followed. In 1986, hungry for that insurance money, Stella set out to take her husband's life. Her first attempt, using a poison drawn from a common garden plant, failed, so she turned to something far more lethal. She laced capsules of Excedrin with cyanide, and on the 5th of June, 1986, Bruce collapsed and died. His death was first attributed to natural causes. How do you make a poisoning look like an accident when the autopsy says otherwise? Stella's answer was as cold as it was reckless. To disguise her husband's death as the work of a random tampering, she planted additional cyanide-laced bottles of the same product on store shelves around the area. It was a gamble that strangers would buy them, and that gamble had a victim. On the 11th of June, 1986, a 40-year-old bank manager named Sue Snow took 2 of the tainted capsules, and died, collapsing in her own home where a family member found her. The break came in the examination room. An assistant medical examiner working on Snow detected the faint scent of bitter almonds, a classic signal of cyanide, and the truth began to unravel. Snow's death set off nationwide recalls and public fear, echoing the earlier tampering panic that had gripped the country only a few years before. Then Stella made a fatal misstep. On the 19th of June, she came forward to claim that her own husband had died from the very same product, hoping to reframe Bruce as another random casualty. Instead, the coincidence drew investigators straight to her. Why would a grieving widow rush to link her husband to a public poisoning? The evidence answered for her. The poisoned capsules contained tiny green flecks of an aquarium product, and the FBI traced that product to one Stella owned. Investigators discovered she had checked out library books on poisons, and her fingerprints sat on the very pages dealing with cyanide. Her own daughter told investigators that her mother had spoken of wanting Bruce gone. The case made legal history. Stella's conviction was the first ever obtained under the federal product tampering law passed in response to the earlier nationwide scare. On the 9th of May, 1988, after a federal jury deliberated for more than 26 hours across 5 days, she was found guilty. She was sentenced to 90 years in prison, 2 long terms for the 2 deaths and additional terms for the tampering itself. So what has become of the woman who poisoned strangers to cover a single killing? Stella Nickell remains in federal prison, now in her early 80s, and has twice been refused parole. In 2022, after roughly 34 years behind bars, she filed a handwritten petition for compassionate release, admitting guilt for the first time and pointing to her failing health. A federal judge denied it. With credit for good behavior, she would not be eligible for release until around 2040, in her mid-90s. There was a hard legal wrinkle to her later bid for freedom. When she finally admitted guilt in that handwritten petition, prosecutors pointed out that the law she hoped to use applied to crimes committed after a certain date, while hers predated it, leaving the door to a compassionate release effectively shut. The daughter's testimony, the library books, and the green flecks all stayed on the record. Why would a poisoning carried out for an insurance payout still be argued over almost 40 years later? Because the stakes never shrank. Bruce was the intended target, but Sue Snow was a stranger who reached for the wrong bottle. And her death turned a private scheme into a public emergency that reshaped national law and keeps her path to release narrow today. Nickell pushed her poison out into the wider world and gambled with the lives of strangers. The next case pulls the focus back to a single household and to a marriage built on an unusual passion that became the strangest backdrop imaginable for a killing. Linley Rennick was a name known around the world to a very specific community. On his family's farm in New Florence, Missouri, he ran Rennick Reptiles, breeding rare and strikingly patterned pythons and anacondas that collectors prized. His wife, Linley, ran a spa in nearby Columbia. From the outside, they seemed a hard-working couple with children and a thriving, if unusual, family business. Underneath, the picture was far less stable, with mounting spa debt, marital strain, and a sizable life insurance policy on Ben that named Linley as the sole beneficiary. On the 8th of June, 2017, Ben was found dead inside his snake breeding building, shot multiple times. The scene was so unusual that investigators briefly wondered whether one of his own large snakes could have been responsible, until shell casings on the floor made clear this was no accident of nature. Could a room full of snakes really hide the work of a human hand? For a long time, it nearly did. The killing went unsolved for roughly 2.5 years. Prosecutors would later lay out a chilling sequence. Linley, they said, had first tried to take Ben's life weeks earlier with a protein shake laced with a powerful medication, an attempt that only left him ill. When that failed, She turned to a person from her past, her former partner, Michael Humphrey, telling him a story in which Ben had mistreated and harmed her in order to win his help. The case finally cracked open when another man in Lindley's life came forward. He told Missouri State Highway Patrol investigators that she had confessed to him, and the long, cold file roared back to life. Lindley and Humphrey were arrested together on the 16th of January, 2020. How do you untangle a killing when everyone involved points at someone else? The answer came through the courtroom, one trial at a time. Humphrey was tried first and convicted of first-degree murder, drawing a sentence of life without parole. But after he led police to the weapon and agreed to testify against Lindley, his conviction was reduced to second-degree murder with the possibility of parole. That set the stage for Lindley's own trial. When she took the stand, Lindley insisted that Humphrey had been the one to pull the trigger. Humphrey and a former co-worker told a very different story, placing the blame squarely on her. The jury had to decide whose account to believe. On the 9th of December, 2021, after a change of venue moved the case to Boone County, the jury convicted Lindley of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The following month, on the 24th of January, 2022, the judge imposed the sentence the jury had recommended, 16 years in prison, combining the term for the killing with a consecutive term for the weapon charge. So, where do the two of them stand now? Lindley Rennick is serving her 16-year sentence at a correctional center in northwest Missouri. She filed an appeal in late 2022, but then voluntarily withdrew it, and the appeals court formally dismissed the matter in January 2023. Her first parole hearing is not expected until the middle of the next decade. Her former partner, Michael Humphrey, remains behind bars on the more serious term that followed his own conviction. The financial picture filled in the motive. Lindley's spa had fallen into mounting debt, and Ben's death stood to deliver a life insurance payout of around $1 million, with her name listed as the only beneficiary. The earlier attempt with the laced shake had pulled in a co-worker from her spa, and when it failed, she widened the circle of people drawn into the plan rather than stop. So why did it take so long to charge anyone at all? Because the only direct accounts came from people with their own reasons to shade the truth. Lindley blamed her former partner, he blamed her, and a co-worker backed his version. Without the weapon and without a witness willing to talk, the case sat frozen until one more person from her life repeated what she had told him in private. The Rennick case hid a killing behind an exotic and unsettling backdrop, leaning on the strangeness of the setting to delay the truth. The next case strips that strangeness away and replaces it with cold expertise, following a respected professional who used the tools of his own trade to plan a death in careful, deliberate stages. James Craig was, by every outward measure, a pillar of his community. A dentist who co-owned a practice in Aurora, Colorado, he had been married to his wife, Angela, for more than 2 decades, and together they were raising 6 children. Neighbors and patients saw a devoted family man. Behind that image, prosecutors said, sat a tangle of pressures. A struggling practice, around $4 million in life insurance that named him as the sole beneficiary, and relationships outside the marriage. He felt trapped, yet a divorce would have threatened both his money and his carefully kept reputation. Over roughly 10 days in March 2023, Craig poisoned Angela by lacing her protein shakes with a mixture of toxic substances, including arsenic, the active ingredient in eye drops, and cyanide. He had ordered arsenic through an online retailer and obtained potassium cyanide from a laboratory supplier, using a form that falsely claimed a professional purpose. The deliveries went to his dental office. What kind of person researches the perfect poison and then goes home to dinner? His own computer answered that question. Investigators recovered searches asking whether an undetectable poison existed and how long it took to die from arsenic. As Angela's health failed, she was hospitalized in mid-March. There, In the one place that should have been safe, Craig delivered the final blow. A hospital security camera captured him handling a syringe, and he administered a fatal dose of cyanide through her medical line. She was declared brain dead and died on the 18th of March, 2023. Toxicology confirmed the cause, with cyanide and the eye drop chemical both present in lethal measure. But the evidence did not stop at the body. How do you build a case against a man who knew exactly how to hide one? Investigators assembled more than 1,000 hours of surveillance footage, along with digital records of the poison purchases and a staged note meant to suggest Angela had taken her own life. Then, remarkably, Craig kept digging his own hole from behind bars. He tried to arrange for the lead detective to be silenced, offered money in exchange for false testimony that Angela had been suicidal, and even asked a family member to create a fabricated video of Angela appearing to contemplate ending her life. These efforts brought fresh charges in the spring of 2025. Could a man really talk his way out of a case this overwhelming? He could not. After a 2-week trial, on the 30th of July, 2025, an Arapahoe County jury convicted Craig of first-degree murder, along with soliciting the killing of the detective and several counts of trying to tamper with the case and obtain false testimony. That same day, District Judge Shea Whitaker sentenced him to life without parole, plus an additional 33 years. From the bench, the judge said Craig had unleashed a path of destruction as wide as a tornado and just as devastating, pointing to the harm done to his children, to Angela's family, and to his own. So what remains for the people he left behind? James Craig is serving his life sentence in Colorado, and prosecutors have said an appeal is all but certain. His 6 children filed a wrongful death lawsuit against their father, his dental practice, and the supplier that sold the cyanide. A judge entered a default judgment against Craig and the practice, while the claim against the supplier moved on. The purchases themselves became some of the strongest evidence. The arsenic arrived through an ordinary online order, while the potassium cyanide came from a scientific supplier, sent to his dental office under a form claiming he needed it for work on a medical prosthesis. A toxicology expert later testified that, by the time Angela died, the level of cyanide in her body was close to twice a lethal amount. Did he ever expect anyone to look this closely? Everything about his behavior suggests he did not. He searched for poisons he believed could not be traced, ordered through accounts tied to his own name and practice, and assumed his standing as a dentist would shield him. Instead, the digital trail he left became the spine of the case. Craig leaned on professional knowledge and patient calculation to disguise a single, deeply personal killing. The final case takes that same weapon, poison, and stretches it across years and across a long line of victims, following a woman whose name became one of the most feared in her country. Sararat Rangsiwuthaporn. For years, people around Sararat Rangsiwuthaporn had no idea they were in the presence of one of the most prolific poisoners their country had ever seen. Known to friends by the nickname Am, she was the former wife of a police officer, and beneath her ordinary appearance, a woman drowning in debt from an online gambling habit. To feed it, prosecutors say, she turned the people closest to her into targets, befriending acquaintances, lenders, and business contacts before quietly taking their lives and their valuables. Her weapon of choice was potassium cyanide, and her method was patient and repeatable. Between 2015 and 2023, Sararat was linked to 14 suspected killings, plus one person who survived. Time and again, the sudden deaths of her companions were written off as heart failure, and she walked away with whatever she could carry. How does a person poison so many for so long without anyone noticing the pattern? The answer is that the deaths looked unrelated, scattered across years and disguised as natural tragedy. The truth only surfaced in April 2023. Sararat traveled with a friend, Siriporn, to a riverbank for a traditional merit-making ritual meant to release fish back into the water. There, Siriporn collapsed and died, and Sararat left the scene with her friend's belongings without helping. This time, the death would not be quietly explained away. An autopsy revealed fatal levels of potassium cyanide in Siriporn's body, and investigators finally had the thread that connected everything. As they pulled on it, a horrifying picture emerged of a string of poisonings stretching back years, many carried out on weekends. How do you investigate a case where the victims span nearly a decade? The effort became one of the largest in the nation's recent memory. Police arrested Sararat in late April 2023 and seized cyanide from her home, and the investigation grew to a case file tens of thousands of pages long, with hundreds of witnesses and dozens of separate charges. She was expecting a child at the time of her arrest and later lost the pregnancy while in custody. On the 20th of November, 2024, the Bangkok Criminal Court delivered its first verdict in the case of Siriporn. Sararat was convicted of premeditated murder and related counts and sentenced to death. Her former husband and her lawyer were both convicted of helping to conceal evidence and given their own sentences. But because she was tied to so many deaths, this was only the beginning of a long road through the courts. What happens when a single defendant faces a separate trial for each life she is accused of taking? The verdicts kept coming. In February 2026, Sararat was convicted in a second case and again sentenced to death, though that sentence was commuted to life imprisonment after the court found that part of her testimony had been of some use. The following month, she was acquitted in another case, with judges citing insufficient evidence. Then, at the end of April 2026, a third conviction arrived, carrying another death sentence that was likewise reduced to life. Through all of it, Sararat has continued to deny wrongdoing. Under the country's legal system, capital cases are reviewed automatically by higher courts, and her remaining trials continue to move forward one by one, each tied to a different name and a different family still waiting for an answer. The numbers behind the case help explain why it gripped the nation. Investigators believe Sararat pulled in well over 300,000 baht from her victims to feed her gambling debts, taking jewelry, cash, and valuables in the moments after each death. From Siriporn alone, she walked away with belongings worth more than 150,000 baht. The named victims read like a roll call of ordinary trust betrayed, among them a police major and a police captain. People who believed they were only spending an ordinary afternoon with a friend. What does it mean that some of her death sentences have already become life terms? Under the country's courts, several of her capital verdicts have been reduced to life imprisonment, where the judges found portions of her testimony useful, even as fresh trials continue. The next case moves from a chemist's quiet patience to a confrontation far more physical, and to a defendant whose own past kept circling back to the very same accusation. Deborah Hewitt. In Lafayette, Louisiana, Deborah Sue Hewitt was a familiar figure among the city's homeless community. She used a wheelchair after losing her right leg, and those who knew her on the street called her Angel, a nickname the press would later twist into something far darker. By the time her name reached headlines in 2010, it carried a troubling weight, because this was not the first time Hewitt had been linked to a death. Since 2004, she had been accused in connection with a killing on 2 earlier occasions. One of those matters had been dropped, the other reduced to a lesser charge of acting as an accessory after the fact. Twice her name had brushed against a death, and twice it had slipped free, which is part of what made the third time so striking. In January 2010, her companion, 47-year-old Dwayne Ball, was killed, and the weapon at the center of the case was one almost no one could have predicted. What could possibly make a single killing stand apart from so many others? Prosecutors said Ball was stabbed, choked, and struck with Hewitt's own prosthetic leg. Hewitt herself admitted involvement, framing the death as self-defense. By her account, she wounded Ball while her co-defendant, John Clifford Romine, restrained him from behind. It was a grim, chaotic account, and what happened afterward would prove just as damaging to her defense as the killing itself. The story she told asked a jury to see a frightened woman cornered. But the silence that followed told a different tale. Ball did not simply vanish. His body lay hidden for roughly 5 to 6 weeks, concealed under a mattress beneath a tree in the 600 block of Buchanan Street, before it was finally discovered in a state of advanced decay. For more than a month, the truth had been left out in the open air. If she truly feared for her life, why hide what had happened for so long? That question became the heart of the prosecution's argument. A witness from the homeless community, Jack Stovall, testified that Hewitt had confessed to him and that Ball had stalked and frightened her in the period before his death. The defense leaned hard on that fear, casting Ball as a man who had hounded her until she felt she had no other choice. But prosecutor Pat McGee pushed back, arguing that no genuinely terrified person would have allowed a body to rot for weeks rather than come forward and explain. Before the trial could move ahead, a judge weighed her mental state, found Hewitt competent to stand trial, and separated her case from Romaine's, putting her before a jury first. The proceedings did not drag. The jurors deliberated for under 2 hours before convicting her of second-degree murder, a charge that carried an automatic sentence of life in prison. But who was the woman behind the gentle nickname? And why did her name keep returning to the same kind of accusation? That pattern is what makes Hewitt's story so unsettling. The 2010 conviction marked the 3rd time in 6 years her name had surfaced in a death. Yet only this time did it end in a murder conviction. The earlier matters had slipped quietly away, dropped or downgraded, leaving a trail that investigators and the public could only fully appreciate in hindsight. Once it was far too late to read the early warnings any differently than before. Her conviction was reviewed on appeal, recorded in the Louisiana court files under her several names, including Schenken and O'Dear, with the decision handed down in April 2013. The outcome did not change. Hewitt remains in a Louisiana prison today, serving the life sentence she ultimately received for a killing carried out, in part, with the very limb she relied on to move through the world. Hewitt's case turned on a weapon hidden in plain sight and a story that simply did not hold together. Each case is heard on its own, tied to one name, one family, and one more meeting that ended in a sudden, unexplained death. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.